Imagine a power held by one person that can erase a federal crime. A power to forgive, to shorten a prison sentence, or even to stop an execution. This isn't a fantasy. It's the President of the United States' power of pardon. It's one of the most absolute and controversial authorities in the entire U.S. government, a relic of ancient kings placed directly into the hands of an elected leader. Today, we're diving into this fascinating power, where it came from, how it works, and the explosive moments in history when it has shaken the nation. The story of the pardon power begins not in America, but in medieval England. Think back to a time when laws were incredibly rigid. Many crimes, even minor ones, carried a mandatory death sentence. The English king held what was called the the royal prerogative of mercy. This was a tool used for many reasons. Sometimes it was to show compassion, to correct a judicial error when the courts got it wrong. Other times, it was pure politics, a way to pacify rebellious subjects or reward loyal friends. This power was a familiar part of government for the American colonists. Their colonial governors, acting for the king, could issue pardons. So when it came time to write the U.S. Constitution in 1787, the idea wasn't entirely foreign. There was some debate, but one of the key framers, Alexander Hamilton, was a huge advocate. In the famous Federalist Papers, he argued that justice can sometimes be too cruel. He believed society needed easy access to exceptions in favor of unfortunate guilt. Hamilton also saw a practical use. In times of rebellion, he argued, a well-timed offer of pardon could restore peace without further bloodshed. So the power was written directly into the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2, states that the President shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. That single sentence grants enormous authority. The Supreme Court has repeatedly confirmed just how vast this power is. In an 1866 case called Ex parte Garland, the court called the pardon power unlimited. It clarified that a president can issue a pardon at any time after a crime is committed, before charges are filed, during a trial, or after a conviction. This is a critical point. A person doesn't even need to be charged with a crime to be pardoned for it. The court has also ruled that Congress cannot restrict this power. In an 1871 case, Congress tried to pass a law nullifying pardons for former Confederates, and the Supreme Court struck it down, saying Congress couldn't interfere with the president's authority. But there are a couple of fascinating limits. The first is that a pardon must be accepted to take effect. In 1915, a newspaper editor named George Burdick was offered a pardon by President Woodrow Wilson. Burdick refused it. Why? Because the Supreme Court, in ruling on his case, established that accepting a pardon is an implicit admission of guilt. Burdick didn't want to admit to a crime, so he rejected the pardon, and the court protected his right to do so. The second is that presidents can attach conditions. In a 1974 case, President Eisenhower changed a death sentence to life in prison, but with the condition that the person would never be eligible for parole. The Supreme Court said this was perfectly legal. Now, the word pardon is often used as a catch-all, but there are actually several types of clemency. A full pardon is an act of forgiveness. It restores civil rights, like the right to vote or own a gun, but it doesn't erase the conviction. Think of it as a legal clean slate moving forward, not a rewriting of history. Then there's amnesty, which is like a pardon for a whole group of people. President Jimmy Carter famously granted amnesty to Vietnam War draft evaders. A commutation is a reduction of a sentence. A president can commute a 30-year sentence to 15 years, or a life sentence to time served, allowing for immediate release. A reprieve is simply a temporary delay of a sentence, most often used to postpone an execution to allow for more appeals. Finally, a remission gets rid of financial penalties, like fines. So how does someone get a pardon? Well, there's a formal process. An office within the Department of Justice called the Office of the Pardon Attorney handles applications. Generally, You have to wait 5 years after you've completed your entire sentence, including probation. You submit a detailed petition, character references, and explain why you deserve clemency. The FBI does a background check, the local U.S. attorney weighs in, and eventually, a recommendation lands on the president's desk. But here's the key. This entire process is optional. The president can ignore the pardon attorney's office completely and grant a pardon to anyone, at any time, for any reason. And that's where the controversy usually begins. The history of the pardon power is really a history of controversy. Let's look at some of the biggest moments. The very first major test came in 1795. Farmers in western Pennsylvania had launched the Whiskey Rebellion to protest a federal tax on whiskey. President George Washington, wanting to establish the power of the new federal government, led a militia to put down the uprising. 2 of the rebellion's leaders were convicted of treason and sentenced to hang. But Washington, in an act of mercy and national healing, pardoned them both. He showed that the president could be both strong and forgiving. Fast forward to the end of the Civil War. After Abraham Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson took over. He wanted a lenient Reconstruction and began granting widespread amnesty to former Confederates. High-ranking officials and wealthy landowners had to apply to him personally, and he granted thousands of individual pardons. This enraged many in Congress, who felt Johnson was letting the old Southern power structure back on its feet and undermining rights for newly freed slaves. The conflict became a huge part of why Johnson was impeached. On Christmas Day, 1868, Johnson issued a final, universal amnesty for everyone involved in the Confederacy, a final act of defiance against his political enemies. But perhaps the most famous pardon in American history came on September 8, 1974. Just 1 month after Richard Nixon resigned over the Watergate scandal, his successor, President Gerald Ford, granted him a, quote, full, free, and absolute pardon for any crimes he might have committed as president. Ford went on national television and argued that a long, public trial of a former president would be a, quote, national nightmare, preventing the country from healing. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Ford's approval ratings collapsed. Many people believed there had been a corrupt bargain, that Ford had promised the pardon in exchange for Nixon's resignation, which made Ford president. The decision likely cost Ford the 1976 election. But history has been a bit kinder. Over the years, many have come to see Ford's decision as a courageous, if politically suicidal act, that put the country's interests first. And remember that Supreme Court case verdict, the one that said accepting a pardon is an admission of guilt? By accepting Ford's pardon, Nixon was, in the eyes of the law, admitting he was guilty. The controversies didn't stop there. On Christmas Eve 1992, in his final days in office, President George H.W. Bush pardoned 6 people involved in the Iran-Contra affair, a scandal from the Reagan years involving secret arms sales and illegal funding of rebels in Nicaragua. Bush said the men he pardoned were patriots who had been caught up in the criminalization of policy differences. But the independent prosecutor, Lawrence Walsh, was furious. He called the pardons a cover-up, arguing that they prevented the full truth about the scandal, including Bush's own role, from ever coming out. Then came President Bill Clinton. On his very last day in office in 2001, he issued a flurry of 140 pardons. The one that caused an explosion was for a fugitive financier named Mark Rich. Rich had fled the U.S. years earlier to avoid charges of massive tax evasion and illegal trading with Iran. It was soon revealed that Rich's ex-wife, Denise Rich, had made huge donations to the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton's Senate campaign, and the Clinton Presidential Library. The scandal was dubbed Pardongate. It looked like a pardon had been bought. While no charges were ever filed, the incident reinforced the public's worst fears about money, access, and political influence. Most recently, President Donald Trump used the pardon power in a way that frequently broke with tradition. He largely bypassed the formal Justice Department process, often granting clemency to people with personal or political connections. He pardoned political allies convicted in the Mueller investigation, like Michael Flynn and Roger Stone. He pardoned Joe Arpaio, a controversial Arizona sheriff convicted of criminal contempt of court. These actions reignited the debate over the pardon power, with critics arguing it was being used not for mercy, but to reward loyalty and undermine the justice system itself. So this brings us to the great debate. Is the pardon power a necessary tool of mercy or a dangerous threat to the rule of law? Proponents argue it's an essential safety valve. The law can be rigid, and the pardon allows for compassion. It can correct miscarriages of justice when the courts fail. And, as Hamilton argued, it can be used to heal the nation after periods of turmoil. But critics see it as a direct threat to the idea that no one is above the law. It allows one person to simply wipe away the findings of a judge and jury. Its history is filled with examples of it being used to protect friends, reward donors, and cover up wrongdoing. The process can be secretive and unaccountable, leading to a system where justice depends not on the facts, but on who you know. In the end, the presidential power of pardon remains a paradox. It is a king's power in a republic of laws. It is a tool for both justice and injustice, for healing and for corruption. And because Congress and the courts have so little control over it, the only real check is political. It falls to the judgment of history and the verdict of voters to decide whether a president has used this profound power wisely or abused the public's trust. It's an ancient power whose story is still being written with every new president who occupies the Oval Office.